evil Colin Coats masterminded the kidnap, torture and murder of financial advisor Linda Spence. Linda vanished on April the 14th, 2011 and was killed after a nightmare 2-week ordeal. During a remarkable trial at the High Court in Glasgow, a jury heard she was held captive and mutilated in the attic of a West Kilbride flat. The Daily Record has exclusively obtained this astonishing video of Coates talking about kidnap and extortion while dressed as a woman. In the footage, which was filmed in his Glasgow flat in September 2008, the killer dubs himself the new gangster in town. He's also caught on camera sniffing poppers and making coded references to cocaine. It offers a chilling insight into the depraved mind of one of Scotland's most dangerous men.
New gangster in town. Young men for extortion, abduction, tying up. Only during funerals, bar mitzvahs. Call 1-800-SUPER-TRANNY. See you. Bye.
This is Colin Coats, or as some call him, Fur Coats, on account of the rather fetching white bolero he's sporting in the clip you just watched. In 2013, Coats was convicted for his part in the disappearance and subsequent murder of business associate 27-year-old Linda Spence. Given a 33-year jail sentence, one of the longest ever handed down by a Scottish court, the judge declared him the prime mover in the abduction and murder of Spence, labelling him devious and as having an extreme and cruel personality. But interestingly, Colin didn't start out that way. He comes from an unusual background for a murderer. Former friends describe him as having gone from an unassuming IT geek a mere decade earlier to a, quote, psycho gangster or so over the course of 8 years. So what sparked Colin's transformation from wealthy business consultant and family man, who pretty much had it all, to a rage-filled wannabe gangster, operating outside the law and ultimately capable of shocking savagery? Coates was born in 1970 into what was termed a decent working-class family in Glasgow's tough Milton area. As far as we know, his home life was fairly stable and he was an above-average student. At 19, after school, he moved to London and landed his first job in IT, working for the Civil Aviation Authority. A couple of years later, he'd secured a lucrative position at international investment bank Morgan Grenfell Limited, with a salary of over £200,000. That's a high wage now, let alone 25 years ago. So he was doing really well. His family was proud. By 21, he'd met and married his wife, Angela. She also had a busy career, working for celebrity hairstylist Trevor Sorbie. The couple, often described as, quote, living the good life, moved into a mansion in fashionable West Ealing, and before long Angela was pregnant with the first of their 3 children. Colin used his savings to dabble in property development, restoring period houses and taking on other small projects. However, in 1999, when the first signs of trouble in his marriage appeared, his hair-trigger temper meant that he became violent easily, and on one occasion he lost control completely and attacked Angela. She fled, reporting him to the police, and Colin was instructed to appear in court, where he was issued with a warning and fined. Barely a year later, Colin, who was an avid Rangers supporter, received a suspended sentence for savagely beating a Celtic fan in a London pub. The Coates family moved back up to Scotland, but his escalating violence and unwillingness to seek help destroyed what was left of his marriage. The couple divorced amid acrimony in 2007. That same year, Colin was accused of ramming Angela's car, but the case collapsed due to lack of evidence. Colin maintained that his car had been stolen. He then started to target her family, after assaulting Angela's sister, Jill, and beating an elderly man who tried, in vain, to intervene. Colin was handed 2 years probation at Glasgow Sheriff Court. Police fitted a 24-hour panic alarm system at Angela's property in Glasgow, in case he was spotted in the vicinity. In 2009, the property mysteriously caught fire and was all but decimated. Coats, the prime suspect, was interviewed by police again, but the case was eventually dropped. In the following months, there were several allegations of road rage brought against him, but he escaped the court hearings by fleeing to his luxury villa on the Costa Blanca. But his determination to keep a low profile didn't last long. In 2010, he made headlines in the press by terrorizing a holiday flight to Spain, drunkenly attacking one man, whilst threatening to bomb fellow passengers, throw acid in their eyes and burn their children. It was reported that at one point he shouted, "I'm Colin Coats. I'm a gangster." According to a BBC report from October 5th, 2010, quote, "When officers entered the cabin after the plane landed at Alicante, Coats kicked the steward, began clawing at his face and neck and striking him on the back. Passengers who had previously been advised to stay seated until Coats could be dealt with were desperate to try and get off the aircraft when they saw what had happened. Spanish police had to pin him horizontally at the back of the cabin to try and force him to calm down. Later, the court also heard how Colin said to one passenger that he would throw acid in their face. He denied conducting himself in a disorderly manner, uttering threats of violence and committing a breach of the peace by placing others in a state of fear and alarm. He claimed he had no recollection of the flight and produced a friend who claimed in court that Coats's drink may have been spiked with LSD earlier that day in Glasgow. Sheriff Neil Douglas rejected this and imposed fines on Coats totalling £2,000. And more importantly, he was banned from flying with EasyJet for life. After this debacle, it seemed that Colin turned his back on all legitimate business ventures. His dwindling property portfolio became a front for criminal activities. He also got very close to local drug dealer Philip Wade, who was a key element in the story later on. It was about this time that the footage, in which Colin appears dressed in drag and boasting about his gangster connections, was filmed in a Glasgow flat. Shall we have another look? Go on then.
New gangster in town. Young men for extortion, abduction, tying up. Only during funerals, bar mitzvahs. Call 1-800-SUPER-TRANNY. See you. Bye. See, I'll do the wetsuit and the Sean Connery. I have the booster. I'm sorry, money right? Flippers, the wetsuit. She gave me the stockings, right? So she was having a dinner party back at her house, but it was only girls that were invited that night. I went up to drop off some inspiration, right? And as I went to drop off the inspiration, she handed me something back. So I went and left for a few hours with my mate Mark. Got absolutely tarted. Turned up at the door later on. She who must not be named was there, right? That's when I turned up. And I turned up just in a pair of stockings.
Oh, don't do it again, honey.
Sorry.
You alright? How are you feeling?
My confidence has been kind of moved up a couple of rungs since I've been, given the full show makeover.
Do you take a sniff of poppers because you didn't seem it?
No, that's just me, my normal.
Take a big sniff. A big, massive, walking no one. For me. Your wee sister. Right, big. A bigger than that.
Oh, far.
Right. Enjoy.
Oh. It's Christmas. We need a bottle of cheers. What?
Yeah.
Pop. Once you're shank pop, you just can't. Oh, sorry.
So, what about this woman that disappeared, Linda Spence? She's referred to in the press in various ways. The most common I saw were businesswoman and financial advisor. In fact, she was neither. She was a con woman and a fraudster. As an aside, I never victim blame. But on the other hand, I wouldn't feel comfortable or honest mincing words just because of what happened to her. She suffered a horrific fate and was treated in ways that no human being should ever have to endure. But I'll be using records and evidence from the court documents, which suggest she was up to some pretty shady dealings herself. It seems likely that Colin's new friend, Philip Wade, introduced him to Linda. She got to doing her thing and convinced him to invest all his available assets, £85,000 at the time, as payment in a land deal at Stansted Airport, an opportunity guaranteed to pay back millions in profit. It became clear during the trial later that Ms. Spence dreamed up fictitious characters who were supposedly in charge of a large-scale land deal at Stansted Airport to be worth millions. She made up email accounts for someone called Uncle Ben, allegedly the main investor, using the internet connection service at Rio Cafe in Glasgow. Uncle Ben replied to emails from Colin Coats, who invested all of his money in the fake Stansted deal. Linda Spence strung Coats along for the best part of a year, promising him a return of more than £3 million when the deal went through. He asked for it in overseas bearer bonds as a way of evading UK tax. Linda came up with the bonds, but they were worthless. Nothing more than a novelty forged on fake Danish government-headed paper. It's worth noting that at the time of her disappearance, in April 2011, she was being investigated by Strathclyde police over claims that she'd defrauded about 30 people in Glasgow in similar scams. When Colin eventually realised that he'd been conned, he was furious. Losing a fortune was bad enough, but losing face was catastrophic for a character like Coats. And sadly, the woman who scammed him would pay for his humiliation with her life. Colin plotted Linda's kidnap in April 2011, and working together with Wade, they forced her into a car in Glasgow and drove her to West Kilbride, where friends David Parker and Paul Smith let them into Parker's flat in Meadowfoot Road. Wade also carried in a tool bag, which was later referred to during the trial as a torture kit, containing garden loppers, surgical tape, and vinyl gloves. They forced Linda up to the attic area and taped her to a leather chair by the arms and waist. In the days that followed, the two men would arrive every day to hurt her as a way of trying to extract financial information. She was burned with an iron, struck with a golf club. Her toes were crushed and her thumb completely severed. She was not permitted to move from the chair for the 13 days she was there and was forced to sit in her own waste. Coats and Wade subjected their terrified victim to what was described later in court as days of unspeakable cruelty, pain, humiliation and degradation. In an article from the Glasgow Times in 2013, John Glenn, an associate of Colin Coats, and someone who had also had dealings with Linda, said that he met up with Coats and had the following exchange. Bear in mind this took place on the 26th of April 2011, just 12 days after Linda had been abducted. Glenn told Leslie Thompson, QC, prosecuting, that as they walked along, Colin pointed to a nearby playground and asked him to follow him, saying he had something to show Mr. Glenn. He said, "I've got a bad feeling about this. Whatever you want to show me, you can show me here." Colin went into the back of his trousers and pulled out a polythene bag. It was an Asda bag. He pulled the top of the bag down and gestured towards me. When I looked in, there was a thumb in the bag. I didn't say anything. I was horrified by what I'd seen. Mr. Glenn was asked about how long the incident took and replied, "No more than 5 to 10 seconds. It's not something you want to focus on." Mr. Glenn told the jury Coats then folded up the thumb back into the bag and said he needed a cup of tea and asked if Mr. Glenn would buy him one. He said they went to a nearby cafe and Coats went to the toilet and added, quote, "I was wondering if he was flushing the thumb away." Mr. Glenn claimed Coats came back to the table, produced an A4-sized book and said that he didn't believe Mr. Glenn had received only about £50,000 from Miss Spence. He added, I've gone over it twice, and people that are having their thumbs cut off don't tell lies. He then said, I want my money, and I want it first. If I don't get it, I'm going to kill you. The following day, it's believed that Coats and Wade ultimately put an end to Linda's life by securing duct tape over her mouth and holding her nose until she finally stopped breathing. Afterwards, they removed her head and dismembered her body, disposing of the evidence so well that to this day she has never been found. After the murder, the gang cleaned the flat in Meadowfoot Road from top to bottom so thoroughly that the only sign Linda had ever been there was a single drop of blood found in the bathroom. But it was enough to help the police build a case. They also found the leather chair she'd been tied to, burnt and discarded in the back garden. Since Linda and her crooked business activities were already on their radar when she vanished, it didn't take authorities long to come across Colin Coates' name. And before long, he'd been taken into custody. The whole gang were eventually charged in the abduction, torture and murder of Linda Spence, and the case was heard at the Glasgow High Court in 2013. During an 11-week trial, the court learned about how Spence had, in fact, been married to an Albanian criminal, so-called Zafaj, and had been recruited to provide intelligence about him just prior to her disappearance. Basically, she was in the process of becoming a police informant for the Scottish Crime and Drug Enforcement Agency, which authorised her to report back about the apparent criminal conduct of Zafaj and 3 others. Detective Sergeant Aileen Boyle from Strathclyde's Police Major Crimes Investigation Team said, quote, she was recruited specifically to provide information, not on Colin Coats or anyone else in the dock, but on Albanian so-called Zafaj. Earlier, Defence QC Gary Allen, representing Philip Wade, asked Sergeant Boyle if Miss Spence was, quote, up to her neck involved in criminal activity, and she replied that she was involved. Mr. Allen added, she had been recruited by the SCDEA to be a grass, a mole on the inside of the criminal investigation. Leslie Thompson QC asked the police officer if anything pointed to the Albanian gang being involved in the alleged murder of Miss Spence, and she replied, absolutely not. More was heard about Linda Spence's background. She'd been declared bankrupt with debts of £39,000 in 2008, but when the debt was written off a year later, she set up a mortgage and lettings property in Glasgow. Despite purporting to be a financial advisor, she had no formal qualifications, and her only experience was 5 years working in a call centre. Linda's best friend at school, Amanda Robertson, who worked for her at the firm in the city's West End, told the court that she was generous and extravagant, buying £300 bottles of Cristal champagne, driving a black Mercedes, and lavishing entertainment on her friends. But Miss Robertson also agreed that Linda was, in her words, a compulsive liar who ripped people off. The trial heard that she'd taken deposits totalling £175,000 from members of Glasgow's Chinese community for properties in a development in the Mary Hill area of the city. Instead of using the money to secure the flats, she'd simply reinvested it into new scams, like the one she had going with Colin Coats. What she hadn't counted on was just how unhinged he'd become, and what lengths he'd go to when he uncovered her deceit. David Parker and Paul Smith, who were also initially charged with Spence's murder, were cleared after pleading guilty to a reduced charge of holding her against her will and assaulting her. After 20 hours of deliberation, the jury found Coates unanimously guilty of murdering Linda Spence, as well as disposing of her body. Philip Wade was also convicted on both charges. Furthermore, Coates was found guilty of 3 other charges relating to his threatening behaviour towards 2 men to extort thousands of pounds from them, as well as stealing a car from Patrick Burns on May the 18th, 2011, after Coates said he would stab him with a pen. As the jury's verdicts were read out, Coates and Wade sat in the dock and made no sound. They were led back down to the cells with their heads bowed. At sentencing, Coates was told he must serve a minimum of 33 years in jail. Wade was given a minimum term of 30 years. David Parker and Paul Smith each jailed for 11 years for assaulting Miss Spence and holding her captive. Following the verdict, the officer in charge of the murder investigation, Detective Alan Buchanan, said, "I hope in some small way that this will bring some satisfaction to Linda's parents, who have had to endure the pain of hearing the graphic details of the torture inflicted on Linda in her final days." Although satisfied with the verdict, the pain for the Spence family continues, as due to the actions of the accused, Mr. and Mrs. Spence have been unable to lay their daughter to rest. There have been reports in the news about police forensic teams examining and preparing to dig on an 8.7-acre area of forestry land near Dunoon. And Colin? Well, he hasn't expressed any concern or remorse for his actions so far. But he has been in the papers again on several occasions. First, he launched an appeal against his conviction and lost. Then there was outrage when, despite still refusing to reveal the location of Linda's body, he was allowed compassionate leave from prison to attend his mother's funeral in October 2016. In 2019, the Daily Record says Coats, 48, was searched after trouble flared between prisoners in HMP Shotts, Lanarkshire. Prison officials discovered that he'd stashed a plastic-pointed 3-inch weapon down the front of his trousers. He had used cutlery from the prison canteen, where he'd been working, and sharpened it. After it was found, he was put into segregation for 3 weeks and thrown off an open university course he'd been studying. Coats appeared at Hamilton Sheriff Court amid tight security and admitted to having the blade in January. He was handed 4 months, but told it would run alongside his current 33-year term. He was caught with a mobile phone, which was duly confiscated, and handed an extra 12 months, which was tacked on to the end of his sentence. I'll end with a quote from the trial judge's sentencing statement, which I think eloquently sums up Colin Coats and his startling transformation from geeky but successful computer nerd to violent, cold-blooded killer. "You are apparently a man of some intelligence, who previously attained a measure of success in your life. But I am convinced that you have a manipulative, devious, and cruel personality, allied to a marked tendency to resort to violence when you perceive that you've been thwarted or to advance your own interests. In my considered view, you are a highly ruthless and extremely dangerous man." Despite the evidence heard at trial, as of today, Linda Spence's body has never been recovered. Do you think there's any possibility Coats and Wade weren't responsible? I'd love to hear your opinions. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you next time.